We come to this time of reflection today. Many of you have approached me and have told me about this passage from youth being used at weddings in your family. And I want to show you a certificate. If you would flash that up there for me, Jeannie. I'm having a little iPad trouble again. If you would flash a picture up for me, Judy Tate shared this beautiful certificate that is a document from her family's history. And you'll see if you probably can't really see from where you're sitting, but at the very bottom there's that wonderful passage that we just heard about your people being my people and your God being my God, and I'll go wherever you'll go. And it's beautiful and it's lovely, but it has nothing to do with weddings. Like so many of our passages in Scripture that we use at weddings, it has nothing to do with weddings. This is actually about the relationship between two women. Between Ruth and her relationship with Naomi, her mother-in-law. Later on, there's a beautiful wedding in the book, of course, with Ruth and Boaz, but this passage is about friendship and commitment to family. And I want you to think and reflect about people in your life who've offered you that friendship that has revealed to you God's love and commitment to you. And as you reflect on those people, I want to invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Lord, help us in these moments to be such masters of ourselves that we might truly become your servants to all other people. Take our minds and think through them, our lips and speak through them, and then take all of our hearts and set them on fire. Amen. We call this the book of Ruth, but the story is really about Naomi. And last week our images were quite simple Lego drawings of judges. You all remember that? The Lego photos we set up. Today we're going a little fancier and artsier, friends. These are wood cuttings that a woman named Margaret Adams Parker has done about the book of Ruth. And then she's taken those wood carvings and stamped them onto paper and created quite a lovely book that goes with the translation of Ruth. And this is her image of Naomi as an older woman. And as you heard in the story that we just read, she was at one time married to Elimelech, and there was a famine in the land, and it was the time of the judges. And the ironic part of this is that Bethlehem means house of bread, right? And there's no bread to be found in Bethlehem. So God's people start to wander to neighboring and enemy territories in order to make a living and be able to provide for themselves. And Naomi and her husband Elimelech find themselves in Moab, and their two sons go along with them. And pretty soon Elimelech falls ill and dies, and the two sons marry Moabite wives, Ruth and Orpah. That doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but it was a big deal back then. Because God had commanded them, remember, don't marry foreigners, right? Keep the bloodline pure. You all have those things that happen today, right? We still have families that say, don't marry someone of another race. Don't marry someone of another culture who doesn't speak English, gasp. But we have these prejudices that still run through us. But this was also part of God's command to keep the people of God pure. And it's something that we don't quite understand in our modern sensibilities, but Ruth is going to become the first convert to Judaism, to the people of God. But before we get there, we have this situation where Naomi has been widowed, and her sons have married foreign women, and 10 years later the sons pass away, and Naomi is left with her two daughters-in-law. And Naomi hears a rumor that things are going better back in her own territory, that there's actually food again, that God is blessing the land. And so she says to her daughters-in-law, I'm heading back there, but you stay here with your families. And Orpah goes, okay, I'll stay here. But Ruth says, no, Naomi. I'm sticking with you. Do not press me to leave you. Don't tell me to go back from here. Where you go, I will go. And she says, where you die, I will die. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. This isn't a sentimental passage about mushy, ushy, gushy friendship love. This is commitment. There is forcefulness and determination behind what Ruth is saying. It would have been so easy for Ruth to simply dismiss Naomi. When we do surveys of older adults in the United States, we find that about 7% of them admit to feeling irrelevant or useless. But I imagine that there are times, if we were to really look inside of what's happening among older adults, that many of you would say it's much more than that. It's not easy sometimes when our culture seems to focus and zone in on young people and dismiss the wisdom and the courage of the older folks. And this culture here was willing to dismiss older folks quite quickly because they couldn't provide economically for the household, right? If you weren't bringing in anything, what good were you? Because you had to have food to survive. But God had put a special provision in, especially for those who are widows and also older folks in general. Do you remember what that provision was? Kate covered it with you. 5th commandment, right? Honor what? Your father and mother. That's not about 3-year-olds respecting their 30-year-old parents, right? Many of you use that improperly with your children. You should use it to say, don't forget about me in my old age. That's really what that passage is about, right? Caring for your parents, honoring your mother and father so that you may live long in the land. And that's what is going on here. Ruth doesn't even know about this commandment. She's not even part of the people of God, and yet she is choosing to honor it and to care for Naomi. And this extreme care and this extreme love has a wonderful word that goes with it. And we're going to up the ante this morning, and we're going to use a Hebrew word. How y'all feeling about that? Let's try it. Hesed. Hesed. I need to hear you get that H going like a German, like Bach, Hesed, right? And this word means covenant loyalty. It's about faithfulness to another person. It's not simply about love. Oftentimes you'll hear it translated as loving kindness, and that's a wonderful poetic way to say it, but it's really about fidelity. It means love that springs from commitment, not love that purely springs from emotion. This isn't about random acts of kindness, but about a love that we commit to share over time, whether it's between God and people or between people who have been created in God's image. And Hesed is so important in the book of Ruth. It appears so many different times. And the first time it appears is in relationship between Naomi and Ruth themselves. When Ruth has this decision to accompany Naomi back to Bethlehem, leaving behind all of her family and her home and everything she's ever known to follow this mother-in-law of hers. Ruth is the first person that we have, as I mentioned earlier, the first person we have outside of the faith who comes to be part of the people of God. How much do you think Ruth really knows about the faith when she converts? Not much, right? She just says, I'm following you, Naomi, back to your people. Your God's going to be my God. Your people's going to be my people. She doesn't know much. Is Ruth's decision really to Naomi or to Naomi's God? Probably both. We can imagine that Ruth is moved by her love, that hesed she has for Naomi, but at the same time, she's coming to know God through that relationship. That's how many of us have come to know God as well, right? Would you reflect on that? Who are the people in your lives who've been gracious and kind enough to you to reflect hesed, steadfast love, a commitment to you? Who are the folks that have revealed to you the power and the very presence of God in your life? For me, it was my Aunt Eloise, as I shared with Abby earlier, my Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Messersmith, my childhood friends, Julia and Katie, who kept urging me to pray better. I needed it. Lord have mercy. They're the ones who taught me about reading scripture. They're the ones who encouraged me to be at church, even when it wasn't something that my family was doing all the time throughout the week. These are people that have shaped me, and I know that you have stories about people who've shaped you. Most of us come to know God because we know and love someone who knows and loves God. And the strength of that human relationship deepens our relationship with God as well. They're bound up together. So this relationship continues to grow between Ruth and Naomi, and Ruth comes to know more about God as she's living with Naomi and her people in Bethlehem. And in the meantime, Naomi is struggling. She's very bitter in her grief. And the time of year is the barley harvest. And when we think harvest, we think fall, but for them, barley harvest was between April and June. So just about this time of year. And Naomi has a distant relative, a kinsman as they called it, whose name is Boaz, a strapping and handsome man. And one day Ruth is caught gleaning in his fields. You might also remember that command from God where the people who are farming are to leave just enough on the margins of the fields so that people who are widows and poor and orphan and sojourners can come and glean from those crops. And this is the practice that Ruth is doing when Boaz stumbles upon her. And she's taking a short break, and Boaz says, "Who are you, and to whom do you belong?" And when he realizes who she is, he remembers that she has come back to take care of Naomi with courage and kindness. And he's impressed with her. And he reminds her that he's going to pray to God to bless her for her kindness, just the way that she has been so loving and tender to his extended family. And then he gives her a bunch of food, right? He gives her some bread with enough left over that she can share some with Naomi, and then he gives her sour wine, which we all think, ew, but is actually sort of like olive oil back then. You know, they dip the bread in it and give it a little taste, you know, just to spice it up a little bit. If you couldn't afford real olive oil, you use sour wine. And he sends these things back with Naomi, but it's not just like a little tiny care package. It is 30 times the amount of a typical daily wage. Imagine getting a month's worth, right, in one day. And when Naomi gets word of this, she is so excited. She starts praising God, and she starts praising Boaz, right? But then, as these older women who are smart in the ways of the world start to do, she begins to scheme. She wants to draw up a plan, because Boaz is one of the redeemers of the family. And in this sense, a redeemer is a purely economic term for starters. If you were a farmer who was in debt, you would have to find somebody who was richer in the extended part of your family to buy up your property and land when you were in trouble, so that land could stay in the family. And that person was known to you as a redeemer. And so that's one function for Boaz, but she also sees that she could maybe just get a little love kindled here, right? Between Ruth and Boaz. And so one night she instructs her daughter-in-law Ruth to get all dolled up, right? Be looking your prettiest, Ruth, right? And Ruth puts on some special perfume and her best outfit, and she goes down to the threshing floor. And Naomi tells her, wait till Boaz gets off work, let him grab a bite to eat. And then when he lays down for the night, go and uncover his feet. Now, let me let you in on a little biblical secret. Feet don't mean feet. Okay? That is a euphemism, right, for something else, and I'll let you ponder what that might be. And so Naomi and Ruth have got this scheme going, right? And so Ruth goes down to the threshing floor at night after Boaz is done working, and Boaz, all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, wakes up with a start because a woman is on his feet, right? And he's like, whoa, whoa, lady, who are you? And she explains who she is, and she says to him, spread your wing over your maidservant, for you are a redeemer. Isn't that a beautiful image? Spread your wing over your maidservant, for you are a redeemer. And when Ruth is talking about a redeemer here, she's again not talking just about the land, because that's one part, but she's also talking about Boaz as an agent of God, the one who also possesses hesed, steadfast commitment to her and her family. He's the one who's going to provide God's reassurance and love to her, protection and sustenance. And Boaz in turn calls her blessed of God for coming to him specifically and not to another younger man. He tells her not to be afraid, for he will do everything she asks. The entire community is going to know that she is a woman of courage and kindness and valor. And he gives to her that night, after he wakes up in the very wee hours of the morning before the sun comes up, he hands her 60 to 100 pounds of grain. This is quite a woman to be able to haul that home, isn't it? And that's part of his promise to her. And when she shows up at Naomi's place with all of this grain, Naomi exclaims, who are you, my daughter? not because she doesn't know who it is, right? I mean, she obviously recognizes Ruth, but she asks that question because something in Ruth has changed. Ruth is now an independent woman in her own right. She has given and received multiple acts of hesed, of steadfast love and commitment, not simply out of need, but out of generous love. What happens in the final chapter of Ruth is pretty complicated, a business transaction, and I won't bore you with all the details, but basically Boaz is wheeling and dealing with the next of kin to Naomi. And in the end, he receives Ruth as his wife. The Lord makes Ruth conceive, and she bears a son named Obed, whose name means the one who serves. But interestingly enough, the story doesn't end on a note of Ruth and Obed. It ends with Naomi cuddling Obed, and the neighbors saying, "A son is born to Naomi." That's interesting. How much childbirth did Naomi do to get that baby? None. That baby's not even directly related to her in bloodlines. And yet, the story is also about redeeming Naomi. This older woman who's left holding the future of her people in her hand. For her great-great-grandson will be King David. After Easter, we're going to spend a lot more time tracking the joys and defeats of David. We're even going to have a dramatic presentation about David. But in the meantime, all we have is this soft-spoken story that we need to reckon with today. Unlike previous weeks where we were giving God credit for wartime victories and mountaintop appearances and all sorts of wilderness exploits, today our story is quiet. God appears softly in this courageous kindness that happens between people. God doesn't come in swooping to rescue Naomi or Ruth or even to put Ruth and Boaz together. God works through human agents to offer hesed, this steadfast love and loyalty between old and young, men and women, wealthy and poor, strong and weak, insiders and outsiders. And this morning I want to invite us into a time of prayer to reflect on where we have experienced the steadfast love of God in our lives. Not in necessarily these big, huge mountaintop experiences, although you may have had some, but in the everyday, ordinary relationships that have reminded us that God is always present with us. And then in turn, we can always be present to other people so that we may say to them, "I will go where you will go. Your people will be my people and your God, my God." And that we as a church community offer that type of steadfast love and commitment, not only to each other, but to the friendships that we build beyond these walls. So as we come to a time of prayer, I'm going to guide us for a few moments, and then I'm going to allow us to have some moments to ourselves, and then I'll close us once again with